Hi everyone, this is Kerim Baran of SolarAcademy. Today I have with me Greg Sellers of Stable Solar. I've known Greg for almost a decade now in the solar industry. So Greg, thank you for making the time. And why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, Stable Solar, and also a little bit about like your background and what you've done before getting into solar and what you've done in the industry and what the goals are for Stable Solar. Thanks for making the time again. Thanks.
Really happy to be here, Kerim. I appreciate the opportunity. Always happy to talk about solar. It's an exciting and growing industry and always happy to share. Interesting background in how I got into solar. I actually backed into it a little bit. My background is in policy of all things. My graduate degree is in public policy, and I was asked by someone who had started in the industry about a dozen years ago to help. There were some entrenched problems that were impeding adoption of solar in the early days. A lot of them had to do with municipal issues that came up. Permitting was a huge issue, a much bigger issue than it is now. It still is, but it was much bigger then. My background, in addition to serving as a consultant, I was also an elected official, so I knew a lot about local politics and local jurisdictions and how to navigate through them. So I kept getting asked to help out with solar by solar companies and folks that wanted to further solar industry, a few friends of mine. And after a few of those questions, I finally said, you know, this actually is an interesting career opportunity, and I'd been wanting to pivot anyway. So I started a small company that did inspections, and we started looking at just making sure that the systems were installed as expected. We got kind of bought out by a larger company out of Chicago, and we were on our way. So I started there and then left there and went to one of the big finance companies, at the time a rival to Sunrun, which is obviously the significant player today.
Clean Power Finance.
Clean Power Finance, yeah.
Then became Spruce, right?
Spruce today, and CPF. I think the greatest thing that it created actually was alumni. There are some really amazing people that came out of that shop. Many of whom I keep in touch with today. A couple of whom are still clients, have their own funds. They're prospering in different capacities. So it was exciting. It was an exciting time being in the city and working in the industry. It was growing that quickly. And then left there. And that's when I think you and I met sometime in that period of time, because I kept recognizing the need for additional focus on the consumer themselves. When I was at Clean Power Finance, one of the things I established was a customer support division, because we had, despite our best efforts, we're getting calls from consumers. Most of the financing was done through leases, which were portfolio level conversations. And so there wasn't a lot of conversation with individual homeowners. And at that time, loans were starting to take hold as a option. It was originally just a small option for consumers. And today, in just a few short years, has become the primary financing resource for residential owners. So I saw that coming. We knew that was going to be the shift. We knew it was a preferred financing method. And so that's how we kind of switched over. So I started looking at how we could provide services to individual homeowners, which is a much different, much more significant problem for the industry, because it's a whole lot easier to deal with a portfolio of systems than it is to deal with hundreds and hundreds of individual homeowners that with each have their own knowledge base. So that's basically how we started. And today we started Clean Power Finance a little over, Clean Power Finance. We started Stable Solar, my current company, just over a little over 2 years ago, almost 2.5 years ago, with the goal of being a primary service provider for residential solar owners. A daunting task then, it continues to be, but one that we're excited about, because we know that solving the problems of those homeowners is the huge opportunity for the entire industry, and particularly for our company. So I can, let me share screen and we can kind of give you a quick overview of kind of the opportunities that exist in the industry, and kind of go through a few things for you.
Right.
Like I say, it's as you know, solar has continued to be one of the fastest growing industries in the country. Certainly in the energy space, it is, and that presents huge opportunities as well as challenges. And as I mentioned, we'll go through really quickly. The market has grown. It's averaged almost 50% year over year growth. It'll slow, if that's slowing, to an average of 25% growth year over year. And of the millions of homes now that have solar, a million plus, a lot of them are older. And we're seeing that growth. And the other thing that the industry analysts have pointed out is that the growth is becoming a lot more geographically diverse. If you look at a map of where solar has grown, California has an outsized influence in the industry through certainly the last decade, and has a much larger footprint than any other state. But we're seeing in places, the Northeast, which has traditionally had a decent sized number of systems, but increasingly in the Southeast and Southwest, particularly you're seeing in Texas, Florida, the Carolinas, as well as Colorado, Arizona, a stronger foothold, more diverse offerings. And we're very excited to see that, in addition to places that we haven't seen any solar. I've just read about a program in Cincinnati today. There's more growth in Illinois, and we're seeing some in the Midwest, kind of the central part of the country, which has for every reason to have just as much solar as the rest of us. So excited to see that. As I mentioned, primarily solar was financed through leases and other products. Today, the majority, 70% plus of new systems are going to be owned by homeowners. That comes with some interesting challenges. When systems are installed, quite often homeowners are led to believe, either directly or through their own lack of knowledge, that the systems will require relatively little maintenance. There's really not much you need to do with them. And in the sense that there are no moving parts, of course, that's true. But the reality is that you're putting power electronics on a very harsh environment of a residential roof. It's inevitable that you're going to need to do some, keep an eye on it, and that servicing will become an issue over the course of the many decades of expected service. So that, combined with we've continued to see as a significant turnover of the installer base. Many installers get into the industry, do that for a few years, and then determine that it's not, for a variety of reasons, that they're not want to continue in the industry. So you end up with a long-term issue, but no long-term service providers in parallel to service that. So additionally, what we've seen in the industry is, and we've seen this a lot, is home solar owners know relatively little about how the systems work. They have a basic idea that it's electricity, that it comes from the sun, and that it is cheaper than their traditional forms of electricity. But in the details of that, relatively little. I like to think, I love cars, and so I like to think about it in terms of how much an average consumer knows about the car they drive versus how much solar. And I think most people know quite a bit more about the vehicle than about their solar installation. So that's been an issue for us, one that we've spent a lot of time focusing on, education and providing the base. And then again, because there's such a long expectation of the systems, most systems now are at least that certainly the panels you're seeing traditionally regularly have at least 20-year, if not 25-year warranties. Same with a lot of the other components. But and to some degree inverters as well. But all of those are going to be requiring reliable monitoring, which is which is not something that we see a lot of the same kind of long-term projections. And so there are a variety of issues there as well. If you can't monitor the system, you don't know how much it's producing, then you can't know. It's like not having a gas gauge. And just you hope that you guessed right and that it's doing what it's supposed to do, but until you find out the hard way, that you just don't know. So that's kind of a quick overview of kind of where the industry is right now. the main system components on a solar system, and I just pulled this graphic off the internet, so it's got some value, but some of the wording is a little off from what we normally would see. But the main components obviously are the panels. That's the most obvious component and the one most recognizable. As we were going through our marketing, we realized that most people refer to the panels. They think of them because they're the most visible part of the system. So they say, hey, my panels are not working. For reasons I'll explain in a minute, that's rarely the case. Panels tend to be more reliable, but that's what people think of. So obviously the panels are the most visible. Inverters basically are an electronic component that converts the power from DC, direct current that comes through the initial interaction on the roof to AC power that then can be utilized by the grid and or the homeowner. Connectors are the components, whether it's the connectors that connect microinverters to the panels themselves, or whether it's connecting the system, all the components. That's another potentially vulnerable and significant component. And as I mentioned last, is monitors. Monitors come in a variety of forms. Some are attached to the inverters, some are separate. Some look like very much like the meter that you see from your utility. Some are very different and embedded, but all of them have the same function, which is basically enabling us to track system performance, either at the system level or in the case of optimizers and microinverters at the panel level. That gives you a sense of this system is doing what it's supposed to do, and if it's not, these are some of the reasons why. So those are the main components that we look at. And I'll say too, and we'll go through this more in a minute, those are, well, we'll go through here, the likely sources of failure. And here in kind of most likely levels is what we see happening if something is going to fail. Not unsurprisingly, we see electronic components, as I mentioned earlier, when you're putting them on a harsh environment. It doesn't mean they're not doing what they're supposed to do. It doesn't mean that they're not the high quality that we expect them to be, but it just means that it's inevitable that you're going to have issues, that's going to be a source of likelihood. We see as an average, a thumbnail in the industry is a 15% annual likelihood of service. Or if looked at another way, if a homeowner has a system, maybe 1 in every 7 years, they're going to have something that they need to do on that system that requires some sort of servicing or update or upgrade or something similar. So not a huge percentage as overall, and if the inverter's failure are a fraction of that, so it's less than 10% likelihood of a failure in an inverter. But because the electronics are there, that's where we see. Additionally, on central inverters, they only have 10-year warranties. And so we find 2 issues with those. One, you're going to have to replace them after a decade or a dozen years. You know that going in. And 2, because they're a larger and evolving component, after a decade, we're starting to see challenges in having in replacement. That you can't. It's harder to get like for like. So you may be looking at an upgrade, which in some cases is the smart way to go. But in any event, they cost an inverter, a central inverter costs upwards of $2,000+. They weigh a lot and often require 2 people to remove them and replace them on the wall or wherever they're mounted. So there's some issues there. Microinverters have a higher likelihood overall of failure. That's because if you have, say, 22 panels, you may have 1 central inverter, but you're going to have 22 microinverters, 22 potential failure points. The upside of microinverters and optimizers, they give you panel level data. And if they fail, you can oftentimes, if you have 20 panels and you have a microinverter on each one, if you have 2 of them fail, then you've still got 90% of your use. So you can actually have 2, 3, 4, and you can maybe just wait, and you still have virtually all of your power continuing. So you don't have a more binary issue that you'd have with a central inverter failure. But there are some challenges there. First of all, you have to get on a roof to replace them. That's always a challenge. Second of all, it inevitably, I think it's just fate often is not the one that fails, is the one that's hardest to get to. Maybe it's the one right in the middle of the array. So it's, you have to take all the other panels out, or So there's there's issues like that that are required. So there is some labor increased cost, but you have some more flexibility in that. Monitoring, actually, I debated whether to put monitoring ahead of inverters. We see a lot of failure. A lot of those are let's say, user generated. Wi-Fi failure is always a challenge that we faced. Folks change their Wi-Fi provider. There's other reasons why they don't, and they don't really think, oh yeah, I got to update the solar, or I have to deal with the solar. Additionally, we all have issues with Wi-Fi, and that extrapolates to that extends to the monitoring. The good news is that the monitoring systems, unless there's a systemic failure of the monitoring itself, they'll usually continue to track and collect data. So you can get the system monitoring updated, and then you can go back and collect all the data that was being collected, but you're not able to access. So, but the key to monitoring is to have it set up such that either through alerts or independently monitored systems. Our company, a lot of companies provide independent monitoring so that we're watching it, and we'll just give you a heads up, hey, something's going on with your system. Virtually all monitoring systems now have come with a consumer-facing product, usually a simple app that you can access. It requires, in many cases, that you regularly watch it and track it, which happens a lot when you first get the system. But 3, 4, 5 years down the road, you're probably not still looking at that app as frequently. So that's something else that we keep an eye out on. Connection failures and other similar component failures are often, in fact, usually caused by an incorrect installation. So you have these connectors that connect the microinverter to the main junction box. Those, if somebody had an off day and didn't quite push them in far enough, that kind of thing. And really quickly too, I think it's worth mentioning that installers, and we'll talk about this kind of in a minute, but installers are required to some degree to have a workmanship warranty, and that covers basically the labor of the installation. So if something happens there, there's a connector failure, it was their fault, they'll cover that, and that's usually, and if we see it and we know it's caused by them, we'll have them come out and fix it on their own dime. But that's a relatively minor issue. Most good installers do not cause the failure, but homeowners expect them to come out and fix whatever is wrong, and there's an issue there because quite often it's an added cost to installers that they're not expecting, and so it's an area of friction. So I thought it would be worth mentioning that. And then the panels themselves, as I mentioned, significant warranties. What's interesting about panel failures is that when we see them happen, they tend to be a little more manufacturing specific, and not only manufacturer. So there may be certain brands, and we can name a few, I won't do that here, but there's a few manufacturers that we know have had some issues in the past. And so then we start seeing them. The good manufacturers rectify that by swapping out their products and doing that kind of remedy. But also it can be by the day of the week, by the line in the factory. Maybe it's just this particular line that had a bad crew or something. So there's a lot of specifics that can really impact, and they tend to be clustered, in other words. So if we see issues like that, panels themselves are very reliable, and we've seen tend to perform as expected. They do degrade, and it's incorporated a degradation of just under 1%, approximately 1% a year, but beyond that. So those are kind of the things that we see out in the field. And then to rectify that, as I mentioned, that we've seen an evolution. So there's still quite a few. Sunrun is the largest, quite a few lease and power purchase companies that are out there. Tesla's still using that as a primary financing, and those larger companies in particular will service their own systems, which is good news, but it's done on a portfolio basis. So sometimes we'll find individual homeowners who are not, maybe if there's a systemic issue, the portfolio owner will decide that you're only going to be at 75% because the extra 25 is going to cost too much to fix. So that kind of thing. So there are a few issues there, but overall, that's one good way to go. It's like a lease car where you can just bring it in, and then when you're done, you turn it back over. And again, as I said, most installers offer service of some level as part of the installation, but their workmanship only extends to their obligation only extends to workmanship. But again, a lot of good installers will tend to provide a broader base of coverage. And as long as they continue to be in business, which, as I mentioned earlier, there's a fair amount of turnover in the industry. But what we're seeing emerge is a lot more independent service technicians. Interestingly, the SEIA, the Solar Energy Industries Association, I just looked at some updated data where they're actually now tracking O&M as a separate jobs component. And currently there's over some 11,000, I think, folks that are identified as O&M or service individuals in the industry. It's a relatively small fraction of the hundreds of thousands that are in the industry, but it's still exciting for us who have been doing this for years to know that it's starting to be a separate entity, and B, getting recognized as such. So it still tends to be a little bit local or regional. A lot of technicians really used to be installers and got tired of being on the roof all day or gained enough technical knowledge. There's some great certification organizations, NABCEP chief among them, that do a terrific job of training. But there's a lot of variation. And unlike, so for instance, in California, the licensing, you would either be a C46, which is an installer, a solar installer, which covers mostly the installation side of things, and some diagnostic and other issues, or you'd be a fully licensed electrician, which covers all of that, but is a little more of an electrical focus. So I think we're still seeing an evolution on that. And finally, service plans, warranties, performance guarantees we're starting to see a lot of those. We have focused on and we think pioneered the service plan part of it. Other companies do warranties and performance guarantees or other types of things, and some installers offer those directly as well, to give homeowners the sense that they'll be receiving long-term protection. So that's kind of how the current state of the industry in terms of the residential solar servicing. And happy to kind of review and answer any questions that may have come up.
Great. Thank you very much for this information, Greg. So what do you see as the increasing trends from a service perspective for this decade? Like, how is there going to be any difference between what happened in the last decade and this decade? Also in regards to batteries, maybe. And also maybe you can talk a little bit about why did you create your products as service plans versus performance guarantees and warranties?
Two great questions. As far as the trends in the industry, I think you're going to see a lot more consolidation and professionalization that will be founded on training. Really, I think we see training as it's a very significant component. One of the things that we are going to start doing now that we have a new administration that's really interested in investing in solar is to start pushing on the federal side to try to expand training opportunities. But I think a lot of it's going to come from the industry. And so that you have consistency of quality, so that you know that a service technician in the Northeast is going to have the same level of qualifications, same level of knowledge and likelihood of resolution. It's something that we're going to invest a lot in, and I know that it's not uniquely, and so that's a big part of it, I think, and consolidation, so that you're going to have that as well. We have done work in 15 states so far. We look at ourselves as a nationwide company, and expecting to, as the industry grows in different areas, Texas, Florida, Mid-Atlantic, other areas, as I mentioned, that we will be growing there as well. the knowledge base of the industry players, it has to grow with that. So just as in California, it started off where a lot of folks were doing installations and very, very few had the qualifications to do service work. So too, well, we see that. And so we want to get ahead of that with servicing, with providing training to those potential servicers. Batteries are going to be a very interesting component. We have we still do B2B work. We work with specific companies. One of the bigger ones is does storage for existing solar installations. They focus exclusively on that. And so we've been able to see firsthand exactly how storage has evolved. What does the consumer look for? How is it going to trend upwards? And it's a very interesting trajectory that I think is going to be similar to, but perhaps even faster than what we saw a decade ago with solar, where the cost per unit dropped precipitously, and therefore so did the interest in receiving it. So now batteries are marginally, they make marginal sense for a lot of consumers in terms of the relative return. But, and we see a lot of folks now who want it because they want to get off the grid. They want to be independent. But I think increasingly the expectation is with Tesla alone, I think is going to do a significant amount along with other major players to drive down the cost of storage and therefore increase the likelihood. We're seeing more and more systems that get storage installed with the solar. The huge hurdle for the industry is going to be that unlike that, there's been pushback from both utilities and a lot of unions and other players who are saying that storage is electricity, storage is not solar. And so that's going to be an interesting component. Companies like ours, have certifications that extend across both. And so we have the capacity to handle that kind of work, but there's a variety of implications that extend beyond. They include training, they include insurance requirements and other regulatory requirements that are going to be a challenge. But like I said, that's how I got into the industry, was solving some of those issues. And I think that we're going to see that as well. And I think the likelihood is that most systems a decade from now will be installed. Storage will be as common as inverters and meters. It'll just be another component that you add, and potentially smart home and other things as well. But yeah, so.
Yeah, agreed. And why service plans versus performance guarantees? Or
a couple of reasons. As we spent a lot of time researching the market, and talking to homeowners. As we were getting started, when I first started, I spent the first 6 months before I hired the two great employees that I work with now. I took every single call and I talked to every single homeowner just as we got started, and learned as much as I could. And then since then, of course, we've talked to thousands of homeowners. And what we found, I mentioned the education component, so there's a little bit of that. We offer a free diagnostic call, which is usually as much education as it is diagnosis, learning more and teaching them a little bit about the system so that we can kind of hone in on what might be wrong. But what we recognize too is that it gives us an opportunity. A service plan is a little bit of a cheaper price point. We can be a little more competitive and come in at a rate that makes more sense for the homeowner. B, provide them with the resources in terms of monitoring. All of our plans have monitoring, which is a primary that we think is required. As well, which then also gives us a regular communication opportunity with the homeowner to keep informing them. We send them regular reports on how their system is doing, and provide other industry information about their system, and tell them about other things that may be going on in the industry. So it's helpful in that regard. But then, whereas a warranty is only going to be enacted if something goes wrong. And then the third one is the way we structure it, we go out to every site regardless. So a service plan covers you if something happens to your system over the course of the term. If nothing happens, we'll go out at the end and just take a look, clean it up. One of the things that has an impact on performance that often gets overlooked, particularly on residential systems, is cleaning. Certain times of year, we see in the Central Valley, where they have a lot of dust from crops. And certainly we saw in North Bay in California, after all the fires last year, significant soot build up. It definitely impacted performance of a lot of systems. So we provide information on how to clean your own panels, but if somebody has a service plan and isn't inclined to get up on the roof or doesn't want to have to worry about getting themselves wet, then we provide, we can clean the panels or take care of and do a diagnostic check as well. So those are a couple of things, reasons why we do that. And then on the performance guarantee is much more of a little bit more of an industrial product that makes a lot of sense on a portfolio. But for an individual homeowner, the cost versus the benefit we thought was a little bit, the cost required to do a performance guarantee. The fact is that if you're out of power for even a few months, much less a few weeks, the overall impact on your system performance is going to be relatively minor. So we just balance those out. But it's exciting to me. I included the other options too, because it's exciting to have that array of options and in the marketplace, because it'll provide a broad range of services depending on what the individual homeowner wants.
Great, great. Is there anything else you'd like to add as we conclude?
No, as I mentioned, it's an exciting part of the industry. When I first started, it was an anomaly, and people would look at me quizzically when I would talk to them about, these things are going to break, right? They're going to have issues. And so it's exciting now to see it as its own distinct part of the industry. And we're looking forward to seeing more growth and seeing more folks participate in the years ahead.
Great. Well, thank you for all this information, and looking forward to having more sessions with you in the future.
Thanks, Kerim.
Thank you.